There's a moment right before something impossible happens, when the world goes quiet. Not peaceful quiet, not the kind you find beside a creek at dusk when the cicadas haven't started yet, and the light goes gold and soft across the grass. No, this was the other kind. The kind where every person in that yard stopped breathing at the same time, and the only sound left in the whole of Harlan County was a black horse the size of a church door slamming his hooves into packed earth and screaming, like something born out of a storm that hadn't ended yet. And in the middle of all that, standing maybe 6 feet from getting killed, was a man named Cody Daws. No boots with silver tips, no hat with a turquoise band, no silver anywhere on him at all, actually. Just cracked leather, dust in his beard, a rope held loose in one hand, and eyes that hadn't blinked in 40 seconds. I know because I was counting. That's the kind of thing I do when I'm nervous. I count. Fence posts, heartbeats, seconds between a man and his death. I was at 43 when the rich man laughed. That laugh, Lord, I can still hear it. Wallace Greer stood up on the whitewashed fence of the finest ranch in 3 counties, expensive boots hooked over the second rail, and he laughed. The way men laugh when they've already decided the outcome, and they're just waiting for the rest of the world to catch up to their certainty. It was the laugh of a man who had never once in his life been wrong about what other men could and couldn't do. "You'll never control that giant horse," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, designed to be loud enough for everyone to hear. "Boy, like you never could." 44 seconds, Cody still hadn't blinked. What happened next? I've written it in this log 3 times now, crossed it out twice, started again. Not because I can't remember, because every time I write it down, I'm afraid I'll flatten it, afraid the words will make it smaller than it was. But here it is, all of it, starting from the beginning, or at least the beginning I know. The weight of a man who has nothing left to prove. I keep a log. Have for 11 years, ever since my father pressed a leather-bound journal into my hands the morning I left Missouri and told me that a man who doesn't write down what he sees ends up forgetting he saw anything worth remembering. My name is Thomas Aldrich Vane. Tom to most, Aldrich to no one, because I hate it. And I am, by profession and by stubbornness, a horse trader's appraiser. Which is a fancy way of saying I travel from ranch to ranch, telling rich men whether the horses they want to buy are worth what the sellers claim, and occasionally getting shot at for delivering that opinion. I arrived at the Greer Ranch on a Tuesday in late October, when the Colorado morning air had that particular edge to it that sits just inside your collar and won't leave. The Greer operation was unmistakable from the road. White fences, green pasture, a main house with a wraparound porch that probably cost more to build than most men in Harlan County earned in 5 years. Wallace Greer had made his money in cattle contracts during the war and had been spending it loudly ever since, which was the kind of man he was, the spending kind, the kind who acquires things primarily to be seen acquiring them. He had summoned me, and I use that word deliberately because his letter had the tone of a summons rather than a request, to assess a horse. Not just any horse. That was clear from the first line of his letter. The black stallion called Midnight Canon, he'd written, which I intend to purchase from a man named Daws, provided he can prove the animal is controllable. I need your assessment of the horse's value and the man's claims. I'd heard of Midnight Canon before I arrived. Anyone who dealt in horses in that part of Colorado had heard of him. 16 hands and change, pure black with no markings, out of an Apache breeding line that ran through the canyon country east of Durango. The horse had already broken 2 professional handlers and badly injured a third in the year since a man named Cody Daws had pulled him out of a flooding arroyo as a 2-year-old and spent every day since trying to convince him that humans weren't enemies. The story was famous in the way that only truly dangerous things become famous, in the specific, hushed, slightly reverent way people describe something they've seen or heard about and can't entirely explain. Cody Daws, I'd been told, had grown up on a small dry-grass ranch 30 miles east of Greer's property. His father had died indebted. His mother had died tired. He'd been working horses since he was 11 years old, first for other people, then for himself, and in the years between then and now he developed a reputation that was split evenly between extraordinary and foolhardy. He could read a horse. That was the phrase people used. Read it the way you read a man's face, the way you read weather. He understood things about the animals that other handlers didn't bother to learn or couldn't figure out how to learn. But he was also, and his own neighbors said this with a kind of reluctant affection, more stubborn than God ever intended a man to be, and he had refused 3 previous offers for Midnight Canon from buyers who might have made him a living wage, because none of them, he said, actually wanted the horse. They wanted the story of the horse. The distinction mattered to Cody Daws in a way it wouldn't have mattered to most men. I arrived at the Greer property at 9:30 in the morning. Greer's hands had been up since before dawn, and a crowd had gathered along the main paddock fence that struck me as too large and too well-dressed to have assembled by accident. Greer had invited people. Of course he had. He'd turned this into a performance before it started, which was either very confident or very foolish, and I hadn't been there long enough yet to know which. I found a spot near the middle of the fence and introduced myself to a woman standing nearby. Hattie Greer, Wallace's daughter-in-law, who had the look of someone who had grown deeply tired of spectacle and was watching this one out of familial obligation. She was the one who told me, quietly and with the patient efficiency of a woman who has explained the same thing many times, what had actually been negotiated. Greer had offered Cody Daws $30 for the horse. The horse's actual value, even by conservative estimate, given his bloodline and size, was closer to $150. Cody had refused the $30. Greer had made a counteroffer. If Cody could demonstrate in front of witnesses that Midnight Canon was fully rideable and controllable, that he could saddle the horse, mount him, and take him through a working pattern in the paddock without being thrown, then Greer would pay the fair price. $140, more money than Cody Daws would see in 6 months of ordinary work. If Cody couldn't do it, he'd have to sell at $30, or walk away with nothing. "Has the horse ever been ridden?" I asked Hattie. She looked at me sideways. "By Cody, a handful of times, successfully," she paused, "not by anyone else." "Not even close to anyone else," added a man to my left, who turned out to be the ranch foreman, a weathered figure named Ansel. He said it without cruelty, but with the weight of someone who'd seen the evidence firsthand. I looked toward the paddock. Midnight Canon was in the center of it, standing in a way that horses rarely stand, entirely still, ears forward, watching the fence line with a focus that felt less like animal alertness and more like deliberate assessment. He was, without qualification, one of the most physically magnificent horses I had ever seen. The black was absolute, not the kind that fades to brown at the flanks in full sunlight, but true black, the kind that seems to absorb light rather than reflect it. He had a deep chest, long through the back, legs that were proportioned for speed and power both. And his eyes, I noted this in my log later, struggling to get it right. His eyes had a quality I can only describe as contested. Not wild, exactly. Not dangerous, exactly. More like a negotiation that hadn't reached terms yet. Cody Daws came through the side gate with his rope and his saddle, and without any ceremony whatsoever. He was younger than I'd expected, late 20s, maybe 30, with the kind of lean that comes from work rather than scarcity, though I suspected some scarcity was involved too. His hat was battered past character into pure function. His jacket was patched at both elbows with leather that didn't match. He moved with his eyes on the horse from the moment the gate closed behind him, and he moved slowly, not the careful slow of a man managing fear, but the deliberate slow of a man in conversation with something that doesn't speak in words. He didn't look at the crowd. He didn't look at Greer. He walked to the center of the paddock, set his saddle down 6 feet from Midnight Canon, and crouched on his heels in the dust. And then he just waited. Greer came up alongside me at the fence sometime in the next few minutes. He was dressed in the particular way of wealthy men who want to appear practical: good boots, a clean work coat, a hat that had never spent a night in the rain. He was maybe 55, with a broad face and the confident posture of a man who has never, in recent memory, been in a room where he wasn't the most important person. "He does this every time," Greer said, to no one in particular and everyone in general. "Sits in the dirt like he's waiting for a train." A couple of the men along the fence chuckled. I wrote the time in my log, 9:47 a.m. What I was watching, I realized, what Greer was choosing not to see, was that the horse was moving. Minutely, incrementally, but moving. Midnight Canon had shifted his weight toward his left hind leg and was rotating his right ear backward and forward in a slow, rhythmic pattern. His head had dropped approximately 4 inches from its alert height. These were not dramatic signs. A man not trained to read horses would have seen them as nothing at all. But they were a horse in the early stages of something, Not calm, not submission, but something more like provisional attention. The kind of attention that could develop into either violence or trust and hadn't decided which yet. Cody saw it. I could tell he saw it because of a single small movement. He shifted his right hand from his knee to the ground, palm flat in the dust, and held it there. Steady, not reaching toward the horse, just available. 9:51. Midnight Canon took one step forward. It was small, half a length at most, but every person at that fence who was actually watching went quiet at the same moment because that step was voluntary. The horse had decided to close the distance. Not because it was being led, not because it was being pressured, because the strange, crouching man in the dust had presented something that the horse had chosen to investigate. Cody didn't move, didn't look up. His hand stayed flat on the ground. Midnight Canon extended his nose, stopped, extended again, touched the back of Cody's hand so briefly it might have been an accident. Then pulled back and stood there with his ears rotating, processing. Hattie beside me let out a very small breath. I realized I'd been holding mine. "Parlor tricks," Greer said. "I made a note in my log. He's afraid it's going to work." 10:03 by my reckoning was when Cody finally moved, standing slowly one vertebra at a time, keeping his eyes low, his hands visible, his whole body oriented slightly sideways so that he wasn't presenting a direct facing to the horse. He moved to the saddle and picked it up. He didn't carry it toward the horse. He carried it past the horse, circling wide, setting it down on the other side and crouching again. The logic of this escaped Greer. "What's he doing now?" he said, mostly to himself. "Making the saddle familiar," I said, without intending to speak aloud. Greer looked at me. "You know horses." "Enough to know what he's doing," I said carefully, because I had been hired by Greer, and this seemed like a moment where precision mattered. What Cody was doing over the next hour and 20 minutes was building a world. That's the only way I've ever found to describe it in my log. He was constructing, piece by piece, a version of the paddock in which Midnight Canon was central, and the saddle and the rope and the man himself were simply elements that belonged there, not impositions but inclusions. He moved the saddle to 4 different locations around the horse's perimeter before he ever brought it close. He placed the rope on the ground near the horse's feet and walked away. He spent 12 minutes standing close enough to touch and doing nothing, just breathing, just existing, letting the horse run his nose along Cody's jacket sleeve and make whatever calculation he was going to make. I watched Greer's expression shift over that hour and 20 minutes. It moved from confident amusement through impatience into something I found harder to name, a kind of low-grade irritation that had a particular edge to it, the specific irritation of a man who has told everyone around him how this will end and is watching reality develop a different opinion. At 11:20, Cody put his hand on Midnight Canon's withers. The horse flinched, a full-body shiver that ran from his ears to his tail, and then stood. At 11:34, Cody lifted the saddle blanket and laid it across the horse's back. The horse moved sideways 3 steps, shaking. Cody moved with him, keeping the blanket light and even, talking in a voice too low to hear from the fence. Not words exactly, or not words I could distinguish. Something rhythmic and continuous, like a man reciting something private. At 11:41, the saddle went on. Every person at that fence was completely silent. Even the ones who had been talking and laughing for the previous 90 minutes had stopped, because whatever was happening in that paddock had the quality of something that doesn't welcome noise. It was too fragile, too specifically constructed, too much the product of work that most of them, I think, hadn't recognized as work until they'd been watching it for long enough that they couldn't stop. And then Greer laughed. That laugh. I described it in the hook at the top of this log, and I'll describe it again because it needs to be understood. It wasn't careless. It was strategic. Wallace Greer was a man who understood power, not the power of horses or the power of quiet or the power of patience, but the social power of a crowd's attention, and he felt that attention shifting in a direction he didn't like, so he used the only tool he had. He laughed, loud, carrying, with the specific tone of a man who is giving the crowd permission to doubt what they're seeing. "You'll never control that giant horse," he said. "Boy, like you never could." Several things happened simultaneously. The crowd shifted, not away from Greer, but recalibrated, the way crowds do when authority speaks, when a person with social weight applies that weight, and everyone around them has to decide whether to balance toward him or away. Midnight Canon's head came up sharply, ears pinned flat. And Cody Daws, finally, for the first time since he'd entered that paddock, looked up from the horse and looked directly at Wallace Greer. He held that for 3 seconds, long enough to be a response, short enough to be a choice. Then he looked back at the horse. I wrote in my log at 11:43 a.m. He made the only decision that mattered. He chose the horse. What that laugh cost, and what it didn't cost, I would not fully understand until part 2. The saddle was still on Midnight Canon's back when Cody turned away from Wallace Greer's laugh. He didn't storm, didn't square his shoulders in the theatrical way of a man performing dignity for an audience. He just turned back to the horse, deliberately, like turning a page, and the crowd had one of those collective moments where nobody quite knew how to react to a man who had been publicly humiliated and seemed, somehow, not to have received the humiliation as intended. I've seen people respond to embarrassment in 100 ways: anger, withdrawal, deflection, performance. I've written about them all in this log. What Cody did was something I'd never cataloged before, and I found myself underlining the observation 3 times that afternoon. He simply declined the premise. The laugh was offered as a judgment. He didn't accept the delivery. But Midnight Canon had. That was the damage. The horse had heard a sudden loud sound from the fence line at the exact moment. A saddle was settled across his back for only the 2nd time in his life, and the result was visible in every muscle from poll to barrel. The ears still pinned, the neck rigid, the skin across the flank doing that rapid, shivering twitch that means a horse is balancing on the edge of something. I've seen horses make that calculation before. They can go either way in under a second. Cody saw it too and moved, not backward, not sideways, but forward and slightly under, so that his body was tucked close against the horse's left shoulder, one hand up near the base of the neck where the halter ring sat, and his voice going again, that low, continuous tone I still couldn't hear from the fence. It took 4 minutes. I know because I counted. 4 minutes of Cody Daws standing inside the possible collapse of everything he'd built in the previous 90 minutes, holding the horse's attention with his voice and his stillness, while the crowd at the fence shifted from uncertainty to something closer to held breath, even the ones who'd laughed with Greer. Even Greer himself, I noticed, had stopped talking. At the 4-minute mark, Midnight Canon's ears came forward again. Cody's head dropped slightly, shoulders releasing in a way you'd miss if you weren't watching for it. I was watching for it. The woman beside me, Hattie, let out the same small breath she'd made earlier in the morning. I decided that Hattie was the most honest indicator in that crowd of what was actually happening, because she had no performance in her, no stake in the outcome's appearance. She was just watching. "He's going to try to mount," she said quietly to me alone. "You sound certain," I said. "He came here to sell a horse," she said. "Not to prove a point. He can't afford to prove points." A pause, not like some people. She didn't look at her father-in-law. She didn't need to. I want to try to explain, here in this log in the only way I know how, what the next 40 minutes actually felt like to witness. Because I've found that when I don't write it carefully, it flattens into a summary, and summaries lose the texture of it, and the texture was everything. Cody began moving the horse. Not mounting, not yet. First, just moving him around the paddock on the lead with the saddle on, letting the horse feel the weight and the stirrups and the rhythm of something attached to him while his feet were still under his own authority. The pattern was wide circles at first, then tighter, then figures that weren't quite 8s but gestured toward them. Midnight Canon was unhappy in the early circuits. You could see it in the way he overreached with his hind legs and kept cocking his head sideways to look at the saddle as though he might catch it doing something. But he was moving. He was following the rope and the voice and the slow, authoritative pressure of Cody's body without breaking into the explosion that the crowd had, I think, been half expecting since the laughing moment. Around the 7th or 8th circuit, something shifted in Midnight Canon's stride. I noticed it before I could name it, a loosening, a slight drop in his top line, a swing coming back into his barrel that had been absent. He was beginning to carry the saddle rather than endure it. Cody noticed too. He slowed the circle down. Let the horse settle for a full stop. Then he checked the cinch, which I could see him test with 2 fingers under the strap, the appropriate pressure, not punitive, not slack, and he gathered the reins and stood at the stirrup for what I can only describe as a long moment of private reckoning. I've been told since, by people who were closer than I was, that Cody's hands were shaking at this point. I couldn't see that from my position at the fence. What I could see was the quality of his stillness. It was effortful. The stillness of a man managing something, not the stillness of a man at rest. His jaw was set. His breathing was deliberate. There was a line in his neck that spoke of someone who was frightened and had decided to do the thing anyway. And that distinction, being frightened and choosing, is one I've watched all my life in horses and in men, and it's always, every single time, more impressive than bravery you don't have to earn. He put his left foot in the stirrup. The crowd noise dropped to nothing. Midnight Canon's skin shivered, that full-body response again, but his feet stayed put. Cody held the weight in the stirrup for 3 or 4 full seconds, then stepped down. Did it again. Stepped down. On the third time up, he shifted his weight slowly to the left and swung his right leg over in one continuous movement that made it look easier than any of us knew it was. He was on. And then nothing dramatic. No explosion. No fight. Midnight Canon stood with Cody Daws on his back and breathed, and Cody sat there without moving his hands or his legs, just sitting, and the horse breathed, and the crowd at the fence was so silent that I could hear a hawk working the thermals somewhere above the ridge. "Well," said the ranch foreman Ansel beside me, in the tone of a man who is updating his understanding of what's possible. I looked at Greer. His face had done something complicated. The confidence was still there. Men like Greer don't surrender confidence easily, but it had curdled slightly at the edges. He was watching his narrative lose ground, and doing it in front of an audience he had personally assembled for the purpose of watching the other narrative lose ground. And the specific arithmetic of that situation was working on him in ways he hadn't anticipated when he'd sent his summoning letter. The working pattern began slowly. Walk first, wide circles that got progressively smaller, Cody's legs barely moving, his hands soft on the reins. Then a transition to something between a walk and a jog that tested the horse's responsiveness to leg pressure. Midnight Canon was not an easy ride. That was visible even from the fence. He was still negotiating, still checking, still conducting his own assessment of whether the man on his back could be trusted. There were 2 moments where his back end came up slightly, where you could see the energy build and test and subside, where Cody absorbed it with his hips and his seat and brought his voice back in, and the energy found somewhere to go that wasn't an explosion. It was not a perfect performance. That, I noted, was actually part of what made it so affecting to watch. A perfect performance would have suggested something managed, trained, already settled. What this was, what anyone honest would have recognized as, was a working relationship between 2 living things that were still, genuinely, figuring each other out. And that relationship, half-built, provisional, continuously maintained by both parties, was more real and more honest than anything polished would have been. At 12:47, Cody completed the pattern. Walk, stop, dismount with the same care he'd used to mount. Hand on the horse's neck immediately, voice in low and continuous. He didn't bow, he didn't raise his arms or turn to the audience. He just stood with the horse. Greer stepped off the fence. I watched him walk across the open ground toward Cody, and I noted the specific way he moved, not conceding exactly, but recalibrating. He'd spent the last 3 hours being wrong in increments, and powerful men recalibrate differently than they concede. What they do is find a new position to be certain from. "Well," he said, he had his thumbs in his belt, the posture of a man reassembling authority. "You can put him through a pattern, I'll grant you that." Cody looked at him. "But I've got buyers coming from Denver," Greer continued. "Men who'll want to see him ridden hard, out on open ground, not a paddock." He gestured with his chin toward the pasture beyond the fence line. "I need to know he won't throw whoever's on him when a jackrabbit goes up out of the grass or a hawk cuts across the sky." Ansel beside me said very quietly, "That wasn't part of the agreement." No one else said it, not in Greer's earshot. Cody was quiet for a moment. I watched his jaw. He was recalculating something. I could see it happening, the slight change in his eyes, the repositioning of some interior weight. "He's not there yet," Cody said. His voice was even, not angry, not pleading, just accurate. "He'll get there. 6 weeks more work, and you could take him out on that pasture and he'd hold for your Denver buyers. Right now, putting a strange rider on him in open ground, you'd be asking for someone to get hurt." "So he's not rideable," Greer said. "I didn't say that." "Then he is rideable." "He's rideable by someone who understands what he's doing," Cody said. "In the right conditions, with the right preparation, that's not the same as..." "What I need," Greer said, cutting across him, "is a horse that any competent man can put through his paces on arrival. I've got a ranch to run and buyers to impress, not a training school for horses that need 6 more weeks before they're safe to sit on." The crowd was very quiet. This was the real negotiation, I understood, not the one that had happened in the paddock, but this one. The one where Greer would try to reframe what we'd all just watched. Cody was still for a moment. Then, "You saw what happened today." "I saw a horse that still needs work." "You saw a horse that let a man on his back after 18 months of work that built what you just watched. You want that work for $30. Silence. Greer's expression did something I hadn't expected. It sharpened. Not into anger, but into a kind of recognition. The expression of a man who has just had the actual disagreement named out loud and is deciding whether to engage with it or pretend it wasn't named. "The price," Greer said carefully, "is contingent on what I can use." "The price," Cody said, "is what he's worth." They stood there, the man with the money and the man with the horse, and I wrote in my log, 1:03 p.m. This is not about the horse. It had never been about the horse. It was about what happens when a poor man has something a rich man wants, and whether the rich man's wanting is enough justification to diminish the worth of the thing being sold, to apply the pressure of need against the pressure of value, and see which one gives first. Cody Daws didn't have 6 weeks to hold out. His property taxes were overdue. I had learned this from Ansel during the morning's wait, mentioned without malice as context. He had $40 to his name and a hole in his roof that would matter in November. He needed this money, or something like this money, before winter. Greer knew that. He had known it when he wrote the letter. He had probably known it when he constructed the whole performance of the morning, the crowd, the laughter, the shifting terms. And Cody Daws knew that Greer knew. That knowledge sat between them in the afternoon air, and I watched Cody make a decision I don't think I could have made in his position. Not an easy one. Not a clean one. A morally heavy one, the way decisions are when the cost of one choice is your dignity and the cost of the other is your winter. He looked at Midnight Canon, then back at Greer. "I'll leave the horse with you for 3 weeks, he said. "I'll come every second day and work him. At the end of 3 weeks, your Denver men can come and I'll put him through his paces in open ground myself. Then you pay fair price." He paused. "But if you want him now today, it's $140, not $1 less." Hattie beside me made a very small sound. I wrote in my log, there it is, the one thing he won't sell. Greer looked at Cody for a long time. The crowd, I noticed, had reorganized itself slightly in the last few minutes, not in a dramatic or deliberate way, but in the subtle physics of a group of people resorting their sympathies. Several of the men who had chuckled at the morning's laugh had moved slightly along the fence. I don't know if Greer noticed. I think he noticed. "I'll have an answer for you by Friday," Greer said finally. Which was neither yes nor no. Which was, I'd come to understand, the only kind of answer Wallace Greer knew how to give when he was losing ground and hadn't finished figuring out where the new ground was. Cody nodded once. He turned to Midnight Canon, loosened the cinch, began removing the saddle. I closed my log for the afternoon. My hand was cramped from 2 hours of continuous notes, and I stood there at the fence in the October air and tried to understand what I'd witnessed. Not the training, not the writing, but the conversation. The thing underneath the conversation. What it costs a man to have a thing worth taking. What it costs him to hold it anyway. I didn't write that part down at first. It took me until the next morning, in a hotel room in town, before I understood what to call it, and even then I'm not certain I got it right. What I wrote was he had everything in that paddock. The horse, the skill, the hours of invisible work, and the rich man had only the money, and somehow that's still supposed to be the more powerful thing. Midnight Canon was standing calm in the paddock, the saddle off, his head dropping toward something like ease, not surrender, just a hard-earned ordinary peace. And Cody Daws was walking toward the gate alone. Friday came in gray. I stayed in Harlan County longer than I needed to. My professional obligation had been satisfied by Wednesday. I'd submitted my assessment to Greer's office by noon that day. Midnight Canon was worth between $130 and $160, depending on the buyer's use case and tolerance for continued development. That was my job done. I should have been on the road to my next appointment in Santa Fe by Thursday morning. I stayed because I wanted to know how it ended. This is not typical behavior for me. I am by nature and by professional necessity a man who maintains distance. I come in, I assess, I leave, I don't develop stakes. I have written this in my log before more than once as a kind of reminder to myself. Assessment requires distance. Emotion clouds valuation. My father said something like it. My first employer said it more bluntly. But I stayed. I told myself it was because Santa Fe could wait. I told myself it was because the weather was uncertain and the mountain pass west of town had been questionable in the rains. I wrote these explanations in my log on Thursday evening, read them back, and drew a line through them. The truth was simpler and harder to admit. I had watched something in that paddock on Tuesday that I hadn't finished understanding, and I am constitutionally unable to leave a thing I haven't understood. Friday morning, I went down to the small main street of Harlan and sat in the restaurant that served breakfast until 10, and I drank coffee that was too strong and wrote in my log, and waited for the day to show me something. At 9:30, Ansel came in. He spotted me immediately. The restaurant was small, and I was clearly out of place, being neither a local nor someone dressed like one, and he sat across from me with the easy confidence of a man who has lived in small towns his whole life and finds the informality of them self-evident. "You're still here," he said. "The past," I said. He looked out the window at the dry, clear sky. "Right," he said. We sat with that for a moment. "Greer told him this morning," Ansel said. He picked up my coffee cup without asking, smelled it, set it down. Sent a hand out to Cody's place at first light. I turned to a fresh page, and Greer says he'll take the horse for 65 and call it done. He said it flatly. Not outrage, not satisfaction. Just information. Says the animal is partially developed and the risk of the remaining training cost has to be accounted for. $65, not 30. Greer had calculated the exact distance he could close while still winning the negotiation, the precise amount that acknowledged Cody had proved something without actually compensating him fairly for proving it. "What did Cody say?" I asked. Ansel looked at me with the expression of a man who is about to tell you something but wants you to know he takes no pleasure in it. "He hasn't said anything yet. Hand was sent out this morning, like I said. Cody would have gotten the offer around 7. I looked at my watch. 9:34, 2 hours and change. "He'll be here," Ansel said, with the certainty of someone who knew the man. "He doesn't stay home with something like this. Never has." "Here meanings?" "He'll go to Greer. He'll want to look the man in the eye." We sat there, and Ansel drank some of his own coffee when it arrived, and I wrote a few notes about nothing in particular to keep my hands occupied. And at 12 minutes before 10, the door opened, and Cody Daws came in. He looked like a man who had been awake since 5 and had made several decisions before breakfast. He was cleaner than Tuesday, a different shirt, his hat in slightly better shape, and there was a controlled quietness in him that felt different from Tuesday's professional concentration. Tuesday's quiet had been about the horse. Today's was about something else. He saw Ansel, he saw me. He sat at a nearby table without the usual social choreography of greeting, just sat, and the woman behind the counter brought him coffee without being asked, which told me something about how often he came here. After a moment without preamble, "You assessed the horse." "I did," I said. "What was your number?" There was a professional protocol about this. My assessment was technically Greer's property, paid for by Greer's fee. I knew that. Cody Daws knew it too, probably, or would have if he'd thought about it. But he wasn't asking it as a legal question. He was asking it as a man who had spent 18 months of his life building something and wanted to know if anyone else could see what he'd built. 130 to 160, I said, depending on use case and buyer. He nodded. Once, like a man having a number, confirmed that he already knew. He offered 65, Cody said, not to me specifically, to the table maybe. I know, I said. It's not about 65 versus 140, Cody said. I mean, it is, I need the money, we both know that. He paused. He turned his coffee cup with his thumb, a small, repetitive motion. It's that he's trying to make it about what I can't do, what Midnight Canon can't do, and the horse has done everything asked of him. Another pause, more than asked. I thought about the moment on Tuesday when the horse had taken that first voluntary step toward Cody in the paddock, extending his nose. The horse had made that decision. Nobody had made it for him. "What are you going to tell Greer?" I asked. "I already know what I'm going to tell Greer," Cody said. "I'm going to tell him no." Ansel looked up from his coffee. "Cody." "No, not loud, just certain. 65 is what he's decided the work is worth when the man doing it can't negotiate, and I won't sell at a price that proves him right about what the work is worth." "You need the money," Ansel said. "Everyone knows you need." "I know what I need." The coffee cup stopped turning. "I also know what I have." There was a silence that had weight in it. "The horse," Ansel said. "The horse," Cody said, "and the 18 months. And the fact that I can do what nobody else in 3 counties can do with that animal." He looked at me, and his look was direct without being challenging, more like a man checking whether he's being understood. "If I sell at 65, I've told him those things have a $65 ceiling. I've priced myself." I wrote in my log later that I didn't have a response to that I sat there and turned the sentence over for a full minute and couldn't find a flaw in its logic, and that the inability to find a flaw troubled me because the logic was so clean it should have had a flaw. Men in Cody Dawes' position can rarely afford clean logic. Clean logic is a luxury. The man with the money and the man without it almost never have access to the same clarity. But Cody Daws had arrived at clarity the hard way, by deciding what wasn't negotiable, not as an abstract principle but as a practical one. This is who I am. This is what the work is worth. These two things are not separate things. "So you walk away," I said. "So I walk away," Cody said, and then quieter, "and I find another buyer." Ansel looked skeptical, not unkind, just experienced. "In this county." "I'll go to Pueblo," Cody said. "Or farther. There's buyers in Denver that'll pay fair for an animal like him." He said this with a confidence I noticed was slightly performed, not false but assembled, held together by determination more than certainty. He wasn't sure. He was choosing to proceed as though he were sure, which is a different thing and often the only available version. I looked at my log. I looked at the man across the table. And then I did something that is not typical for me, not professionally sanctioned, and which I recorded that evening with an asterisk and the note, "This is not assessment work." "I know a man in Denver," I said. "Horse trader named Howell, James Howell. He runs contract supply for 3 or 4 of the bigger ranches in the territory, and he has buyers who come to him specifically for horses with unusual training histories. He's paid premium before for animals with complicated backgrounds." I wrote Howell's address from memory on a page of my log, tore it out, slid it across the table. "I can write you an introductory note. If you're going to Pueblo or Denver with Midnight Canon, you should stop at Howell's first." Cody looked at the paper. He didn't pick it up immediately. There was a moment where I could see him weighing something, not the offer itself, but what it meant to take it. Men who have been maneuvered learn to inspect the angles of generosity. "Why?" he asked. I considered the question seriously. "Because I watched Tuesday," I said, "and I'm good at my job, which means I can tell the difference between a man who's asking fair price and a man who's asking fair price and is right." I paused. "You're both." He picked up the paper. I wrote Howell the note right there, on a clean page of my log, tore it out with a care that bent the corners slightly, and handed it to him. He folded both papers, the address and the introduction, and put them inside his jacket without ceremony. We sat for another few minutes without talking much. Ansel ordered something to eat. I finished my coffee. Outside, Harlan County went about its Friday business in the gray October light, and somewhere on the Greer property 6 miles east of us, Midnight Canon was probably standing in the paddock with his ears forward and his eyes doing that assessment thing, deciding what to make of the world. I should tell what happened next. What I know of it anyway, which is limited by the fact that I did eventually leave for Santa Fe, and my knowledge becomes second-hand after that. What I know, Cody Daws went to the Greer ranch that afternoon. He told Greer in front of Ansel and 2 of the hands who happened to be nearby that he was declining the $65 offer. He thanked Greer for his time. He retrieved Midnight Canon from the paddock, saddled him, this time in about 12 minutes according to Ansel's account, which told you something about how far the horse had come in 4 days, and rode him out the main gate and down the road. Greer said nothing according to Ansel, which was not nothing. From a man who always had something to say, silence was its own kind of statement. What I know, Cody made it to Pueblo in 4 days, riding Midnight Canon most of the way and leading him the rest when the terrain required it. The ride itself, The sustained exposure to varied ground, sounds, terrain, was possibly the best training the horse received in that entire period, which was either very clever or very lucky, or, as I wrote in my log when I heard it, the kind of thing that only looks like luck when you're watching from outside. What I know, James Howell saw Midnight Canon on a Wednesday in early November, watched Cody put him through a modified version of what he'd done in Greer's paddock, adapted for an open corral, and made an offer the following morning. $170. I learned this in a letter from Howell himself, about 6 weeks after my time in Harlan County, in which he also mentioned that he'd sold Midnight Canon to a ranching operation in New Mexico for $210, and that they were very pleased with the animal. I wrote in my log in the margin of Howell's letter, 210. And then I just sat with that for a while. I've thought about Wallace Greer since then. I've tried to think about him honestly, because I find that pure villains are rarely accurate, and that accuracy matters more to me than satisfying narrative. Greer was a man who had learned, over 50-some years, that money was the most reliable translator of worth. That value was determined by what could be extracted at the moment of exchange, and that the extraction itself was a kind of proof. He wasn't cruel, exactly. He was just a man who had made a complete system out of a partial truth, and had lived inside that system long enough that the outside of it had become illegible. What he couldn't read was Cody Daws, a man without leverage behaving as though he had leverage, not because he was bluffing, but because he'd found the one thing Greer couldn't buy or reduce: the specific knowledge of what the work was worth, held by the person who had done it. And Midnight Canon, a horse that at 2 years old had been pulled from a flooding arroyo by a stranger's hands. Pulled, I'd been told, while the stranger was himself halfway into the current, braced against a cottonwood root, dragging the animal to solid ground because it was there and drowning, and he couldn't walk away from a thing that was drowning if he could stop it. 18 months later, that horse had extended his nose toward that same man's hand in a paddock in front of 40 people, had decided, through whatever horse calculus operates in those deep, dark, difficult minds, that the man was a known quantity, that the known quantity was trustworthy. You don't buy that for $65. You don't buy it for $170 either, honestly. But at least $170 is a number that admits something was earned. I got a second letter 3 months after Howell's. It was from Cody Daws himself, which surprised me. I'd given him my postal address in Santa Fe without expecting he'd use it, mostly because I'd given it as a gesture rather than an actual expectation. The letter was short. His handwriting was careful in the way of a man who doesn't write often and therefore writes deliberately when he does. He had, he wrote, paid his property taxes, fixed the roof, and he had, with part of what remained after those necessities, purchased a 2-year-old mare from an Apache family he knew south of Durango, a horse with unusual conformation and a difficult history, which he was spending his mornings working. She's coming along, he wrote, slowly, but she's smart and she's started to let me close. The slow ones always end up being worth it. He did not mention Greer. He did not mention the laugh or the paddock or the $65 or the arithmetic of what had been offered versus what had been taken. I don't think he'd forgotten it. I think he'd put it where it belonged, in the past where it couldn't touch the present work. At the bottom of the letter, as a kind of postscript, he'd written, "Thank you for the note to Howell. You didn't have to." I wrote back, I said, "I know that's why it mattered." I've been uncertain since then whether that was the right thing to say, whether it was too much or not enough or exactly correct. I've turned it over in various hotel rooms in various parts of the territory, and not arrived at a conclusion. What I've arrived at is this: there is a kind of man who measures everything and a kind of man who holds some things beyond measure, and the friction between those two kinds of men is one of the oldest and most unresolved arguments that the West, that any place, has ever had with itself. Cody Daws knew what the horse was worth, not because he'd been told, because he'd been there for every minute of the earning. That is not a thing you can laugh away. I closed my log that night, the log from that whole stretch, Harlan County through Santa Fe through the months of letters, and I sat for a while with my pen in my hand and the window open and the cold air coming in off the desert. And somewhere out east of Durango, I imagined, a man was out in the early morning with a difficult mare, moving slowly, his voice low and continuous and patient, and the horse was deciding. The way horses always decide, eventually, on their own terms and in their own time, whether to take one more step forward.